The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. Warning, the following video contains strong language and the use of satire and sarcasm to shatter their fragile egos perpetually in the clutches of toxic masculinity. I gotta tell you all, today has been kind of a crazy day and I would like Murphy to leave. The topic I'm going to be covering today is the case of Glen Rogers, who was dubbed the cross-country killer or the Casanova killer, which I think is ridiculous because he was no Casanova. Now, a lot of the cases that deal with serial killers or murderers in general are about men that have no concept of impulse control, maturity, emotional regulation, empathy, or accountability. Well, this guy was no exception. He was a real fucking tool with his insecurity and easily baited and bruised ego, much like his chest-thumping orange idol in charge. Hello, my lovelies. I'm so glad that you're joining me today. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm Madam Roman, and for those of you new to the channel, I offer wisdom highlights from a woman's perspective as we put on our highest red-bottom slippers and strut our stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. We'll explore accounts of true crime, dark histories, mysteries, and mayhem in the constant quest of empowerment, knowledge, and the insight to survival. So get your cup of tea, glass of wine, or whatever makes you happy, and let's get started. And if you haven't already, don't forget to support the channel. Like, subscribe, share, hit that notification button. On the morning of Tuesday, November 7th, 1995, the housekeeper for the Tampa 8 Inn went to clean room 119. The occupant was scheduled to vacate the room that day, but there was a handmade Do Not Disturb sign still on the door that had been made out of a page from the area phone book. After knocking and confirming there was no response, she entered the room. Making sure there was still no one there, she looked around the room and into the bathroom, but she was horrified at the discovery she made in the bathtub, the partially clothed, bloodied, lifeless body of a woman. Although there was no wallet for investigators to determine the woman's ID, they were able to see that the cause of death was likely homicide. She had defensive wounds, abrasions, and bruises, and had been stabbed in the chest and buttocks. Some of her bloody clothes and towels were in a pile on the floor. Because of the blood splatter and the holes in her clothes, it was determined she had been standing, fully clothed, when attacked. In a frenzy of his twisted actions, he had then taken some of her clothes off and placed her in the tub, accidentally leaving his wristwatch under her body. Not that he had any real desire to conceal his identity. After all, when asking the motel front office about the person they had rented the room, they had plenty of information to give. The tall, white, blonde, tanned, kind of built man at about 30s had arrived by a cab and registered the room under the name Glen Rogers. They said he had rented the room for 2 nights on Saturday, November 4th. The afternoon of the next day, the clerk had seen the man packing things into a white Ford Festiva and actually confronted the man. It wasn't wise to leave his things in the car overnight because the area had frequent car break-ins. Of course, he brushed her off. He came into the hotel office a few minutes later to extend his stay for another night, so he would have left on the 6th, but he extended the checkout to the 7th. He asked for a Do Not Disturb sign, but they didn't have any, so he asked that the cleaning service be notified not to clean the room until checkout. So this was the 5th, right? The next day on the 6th, the clerk saw the man leave the motel at around 9 a.m., but still the cleaning lady did not enter the room to clean because the Do Not Disturb sign was still on the door. Without immediate ID, the woman was named Jane Doe. News outlets reported on the scene of the motel, the murder, and the description of the victim, and with that information, a frantic mother's search for her daughter had ended. Mary Dyke was supposed to meet her daughter and friends at Showtime Bar after work. It was their third place, their Cheers, the place that everyone knows your name. When Mary arrived at the bar, their friends told her that Tina had run quick to give a guy they had been hanging out at the bar with a ride home and would be back soon. But after a while, she knew there was something not right. An hour and a half later, and repeatedly paging Tina, 30 times in fact, and getting no response, Mary's gut instinct was on fire. The next day, Tina didn't show up for work. Mary knew for certain something had happened. When she heard the news reports about the woman found, she contacted police. With the identification of the body, it was confirmed to be her daughter, Tina Marie Cribbs. Tina was a happy, vivacious, 34-year-old, single mother of 2, working hard and wanting to relax at a familiar spot when she and her friends met a rando named Randy. Randy was handsome, if you like that sweaty, misogynistic mansplainer Florida type. He was charismatic and buying drinks and trying to charm off the pants of some lucky, lonely lady. After some time together, he asked Tina if she would give him a ride to where he was staying. 2 red flags here. Number 1, a guy throwing around cash but doesn't have a car? Repeat after me. Hell no. Number 2, Grown-ass men don't need help from women. Period. Hand him the number for a cab company since he can afford one. You are not his caretaker. By the time Mary had identified her daughter, Tina's wallet had been found at a rest stop near Tallahassee. Fingerprints inside the wallet had matched those found in the motel room and were those of Glen Rogers. Police confirmed with witnesses, including the bartender, that Rogers was the man Tina had given a ride to. It appeared that Rogers had stolen Tina's car, the white Ford Festiva, and was on the run. Authorities identified through NCIC that Rogers was a wanted man in other states for other similar grotesque murders. A nationwide manhunt ensued. Unfortunately for authorities, Tina Cribbs was not Rogers' first victim or his last. Glen Rogers was born in Hamilton, Ohio on July 25, 1962, to Father Claude Sr. and Mother Edna. He was one of 7 children. The couple had gone in front of a judge before her pregnancy with Glen to be granted permission for Edna to have her tubes tied. The couple knew they were not capable of managing any more children, but the judge denied the request. Yeah, Ohio, 1962. Women were not allowed birth control without a husband and a judge's consent. Seems like we're kind of backsliding 60 years. His father, Claude Sr., was a moonshiner who raged against, well, everything. Authority, structure, love, kindness. He was a drinker that didn't even listen to the wisdom of don't get high on your own supply. He would beat and threaten his wife and children with guns and violence. Edna had been a church-going Christian when she met and married Claude. She was a good girl, but she was only 16. After the wedding, Claude Sr. let her know that she would not be going to church anymore. His insecurities became his rage, which required her isolation from anything that would support her decision to leave his pathetic ass. Typical abuser pattern. Because of Claude's inability to keep a steady job and his unwillingness to check his pride, he did not provide for his family. The family was poor. You see, back then, America was isolationist, and it didn't have a lot of trade with other countries, so things like clothing and everyday essentials were pricey. Although there were more opportunities for upward mobility for those willing than there are today, but I digress. The children wore stained, torn clothes, had little to eat, and didn't have any structure or support.
I got you. I got you.
Oh, you're such a baby. Even at school, they were bullied and ostracized, which only made them rebel and anger, just as their father had. The children had little to survive. Abused, neglected, hungry, and scared, the children, particularly the 2 boys, Glen and his older brother Clay, realized that petty theft, stealing, burglarizing would get them what they needed to survive. Or should I say, Clay realized that because Glen was younger and smaller, he was able to commit crimes easier with even less consequences. He would use Glen, and if caught, their crimes were rewarded with hot meals, warm beds, and the safety away from the abuse of their father. I'm going to get down? Okay. I can get down. To foster homes or juvie centers. They were being taught that committing crimes had no negative consequences, no matter how brazen or extreme their crime was. Glen was finally expelled from school when he was 16 after the reform school was unsuccessful. Not that reform schools was ever a successful progression to stability or personal growth. Like father, like son, he got a 14-year-old girl pregnant, married her, and began abusing her. They had another child together before he beat her so bad she ended up in the hospital. He fled to California and she filed for divorce. He bailed on his continued responsibility as a father and started again with another woman and marriage and child. But his insecurities caused his jealousy, and the abuse started with her as well, and the marriage ended in violence and divorce. Glen went on to become a drifter and a con man, doing odd jobs and living hand-to-mouth in various states across the U.S. He began to work for police as an informant and learned how to work the system and use his smooth-talking skills to his advantage so that he could commit crimes and use information to get out of trouble. Clay would later collaborate to publish a book about his brother's life, which is always problematic for me. It seems like a form of rewriting history. Facts are facts. Truth is perspective. You can say whatever you want. It doesn't make it a fact. Clay gave any excuse from abuse to neglect to devil worship to molestation to just evil for Glen's actions. He stated that those with a loving start become good people and those with an abusive start become bad people. Now look, I know that I have a compassion ship the size of a pinhead for some people, but this shit just gets old. Grow the fuck up and stop taking your woe is me frustration out on others. And hey, you really want to get back at the society that tried to keep you down? You really want to prove them wrong? Take a tip from the big fat book of lessons women have to learn. Revenge body that shit. Better yourself, make yourself a success, and make them regret ever having let you down. Not because they fear you, but because you are such a fucking rock star that they didn't see it right in front of their eyes. Use that privilege and be better than you were given, and let them know it was despite their lack of help. That's my Roman PSA for the day. Woosah. But of course, this was not the choice Glen made. Instead, he sank harder into his comfort blankie of self-pity and hatred, blaming everyone else and the world for his life and not doing a damn thing to improve his circumstances. You can't fail if you never try. He wanted to hate and be angry. He was rejecting the world before the world rejected him. He used it to fuel his projected rage that his mommy didn't protect him from his terrifying father, because God forbid she was feeling abused and terrified as well, and yeah, with how many kids? He became his father, abusing anyone more vulnerable than he was. Glen started, and I say that with quotes because, according to his brother, Glen's murders could have started earlier, but let's just stick to the facts. Mark Peters, a 71-year-old veteran and retired electrician that offered Glen a place to stay in 1994. Here was a man trying to help Glen, and the man ends up missing, along with any valuables, a coin collection, guns, and antiques that Glen could get money from hawking. The man's skeletonized body was found in the Rogers family cabin in Kentucky, tied to a chair under a pile of furniture. When authorities examined the body, the cause of death could not be determined, but was suspected homicide. The body actually had to be ID'd through the bones studied by an anthropologist. Glen was then wanted for questioning. Having stolen Mark Peters' car and his son James Peters' ID, Glen was on the run and headed back to California to evade police. Glen got a job working at a construction company painting houses and, according to his family, partying with Nicole Brown Simpson. Which makes me laugh at the ridiculousness that here's this beautiful, wealthy woman with the power to make her own choices and had the confidence to say no when she didn't want something. If he did know her, she would probably never have given him a second thought, which would have pissed him off, of course. But she was brutally murdered June 12, 1994, but I'll come back to that in a minute. It was in the fall of 1995 that Glen's spiral into frenzied mania of destruction triggered a countrywide manhunt. In September of that year, an employee at a medical center was coming into work in the early morning hours when she saw a truck burst into flames. A white man with long blonde hair ran away from the scene. When authorities put out the fire, they could see a body inside the cab, burned beyond recognition. At autopsy, the body was determined to be that of a woman, and the cause of death was not the fire, but rather strangulation. There was no soot in the passageways, so she was not breathing when the fire started. It was also determined that she had been raped. Pete's pooping. She was quickly identified as Sandra Sam Gallagher from the truck registration. Sam was the mother of three that had called her estranged husband the day before to tell of her $1,200 lottery win. They were still close and considering reconciliation. He had stated that she had been celebrating at McRed's bar in Van Nuys. According to witnesses, she met Glen there, who was buying everyone drinks and paying special attention to single ladies who liked to say yes, because confidence turned him off. He charmed her with his charisma and good looks. When he asked for a ride to his apartment, she agreed. His apartment was close to the vicinity of the medical facility that her truck would be found at the next day. Police were able to positively ID Glen as Glen Rogers, the man Sam had given a ride to the day before, and obtain a search warrant for his apartment. Sam's purse without her ID and cash were found. It was clear that there had been an altercation and Rogers fled in a hurry. With the evidence, Rogers was charged with the murder of Sandra Gallagher, and with the urgency, his information was entered in NCIS. I always want to say NCIS. NCIC, a national database to apprehend fugitives. Once again, Glen Rogers was on the run. His next stop, Mississippi. Mississippi. At the Mississippi State Fair, 5'4", 110-pound single 34-year-old mother, Linda Price, was waiting for the love of her life to walk into her life. She was optimistic about her future, despite hard times that she had had in relationships with men. When she met Rogers, she couldn't stop saying what a good-looking man he was. Gag me with a spoon. After 3 days, they got an apartment together, and within a couple weeks, she realized the trouble she was in. Rogers tried to charm her family, but they could see who he was. He was violent and volatile when he had been drinking or rejected. He was controlling and abusive and even threatened her female family members, stating, "You're next," when they would try to come aid Linda. She had stated to her family and friends that she was afraid he would hurt her and that if something happened to me, don't let him get away with it. When her mother and her sister hadn't heard from her or seen her since the day before Halloween, they knew right away that Rogers had done something to Linda. Police did a welfare check and discovered Linda's body in the bathtub. She had been stabbed and her throat had been cut. There was no evidence of an intrusion, no forced entry, nothing missing except for her purse and jewelry. The doors were locked, there was no weapon, and her face had been covered with a washcloth. All indications that the perpetrator knew the victim. The message, "Glen, we found you," was on the mirror in lipstick, obviously to try to deflect blame from himself to a mystery intruder. When investigators put Glen Rogers' information in NCIC, they saw that Rogers was wanted in California for the murder of Sandra Gallagher and contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. The FBI issued a warrant for Glen Rogers' arrest for unlawful flight. Again, Glen Rogers was on the run. By the time Rogers' family was pleading on news reports for him to turn himself into authorities after the murder of Tina Cribbs, Rogers was on his way back to Louisiana. He had called his sister, bragging that he had let crazy take over, and was making a smacking sound that he said he was smacking the asses of dead women. At the time, he was already claiming that he had committed 70-plus murders and was insatiable for more. Days before his trip to Tampa and the murder of Tina Cribbs, Rogers had been in Louisiana and met Andy Sutton and her friend Teresa in a bar. She was a single mother of 4 and was living with her friend. When Andy met Rogers, she thought he was different from the other men she had relationships with. He told her that he was going to Florida for a few days and he would be back soon. After Rogers returned to town, he reunited with Andy. The next morning, Teresa found Andy's lifeless body on her punctured waterbed in her room. Her face had been covered with a pillow, hiding the frozen look of terror she had endured. The blood from her stab wounds having drained out of her, much like the water escaped onto the floor of the room from the bed. When police ran Glen Rogers' information through NCIC, of course Louisiana authorities realized the frenzied dangerousness of the man that had nationwide media and resources looking to seek his capture. It became apparent that Rogers was now killing with more frequency and without hesitation, making him deadly and difficult to apprehend before making others his victims. Police were desperate to get news of this prolific predator out for his capture and to alert potential vulnerable women. America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh, featured Glen Rogers as a wanted fugitive for the murders in several states, and he was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. News outlets were interviewing his family with pleas to turn himself in. Authorities were posting wanted posters at rest stops and using truckers with CBs on the roads as resources. Finally, Rogers called relatives, threatening their lives, and there were even concerns that Rogers would try to kill his mother and her boyfriend, Bob. Rogers hated that after his father had had a stroke and become invalid for 2 years before his death, his mom, who was taking care of Claude in his invalid state, started seeing Bob. After Claude's death, Edna moved Bob in with her. This was the ultimate betrayal for Glen. It was suggested that the deaths of these women resulted from their resemblance to his mother, and he was acting out his desire to kill her. Rogers did go to a cousin's house in Kentucky, and after the visit, she called the police. With his last known location in the area, officers and patrol cars were on the lookout for the white Ford Festiva that Rogers was still driving. When he was spotted and the police tried to pull him over, he gave chase. Okay, so this is a Ford Festiva. Sorry. But I had this mental image of this big hamburger guy in a clown car trying to outchase the police. So he barreled through roadblocks and the attempts to shoot out his tires, driving on the wrong side of the highway. But finally, it was the pit maneuver that led to his capture. Which reminds me, have you seen the grappler technique? I think it's great. Police can use this nylon strap to tangle the fugitive's back tires and the tire can no longer turn. It's way safer, controlled, more efficient, and less costly. It's so freaking simple. Squirrel! So the cops rush the car and get Rogers in handcuffs, and he was pissed. He was trying to resist and clearly agitated and angry. News reporters were asking if he committed the murders, and of course he says no. And he was all cagey, like, oh, there's more to the story, blah, blah, blah. You know, how criminals say, I'm innocent, but I can't prove it right now because the master manipulator is involved. So conspiracy theory. In the car, police found bloody clothes, women's purses, the key to the Tampa 8 motel room that Tina Cribbs was murdered in, and a watch that belonged to Linda Price. But what does he do as soon as he gets to the station? He confesses to the more than 70 murders in various states. Of course, he also lawyered up when he was asked to provide authorities with any of the evidence for these murders that he claimed. And then his story changed. He was now claiming innocence. A coincidence that he ended up with the wrong woman at the wrong time. Rogers was charged in Kentucky with first-degree wanton endangerment and then extradited to Florida for the murder of Tina Cribbs. During the trial of her murder, Rogers was arrogant and cocky enough to think that he could represent himself. Yeah, someone who represents himself has a fool for a client. However, he relented to a defense attorney. They tried to use the mental illness with defective defense. They also tried to rebuke the motel clerk's testimony on the time he left the motel and the medical examiner's testimony of the time of her death. They stated that Rogers left Cribbs at his motel alive and then she was murdered. This was a weak defense and the jury wasn't buying in. There was just so much evidence, much of which the defense had no explanation for. In 1997, he was found guilty for the murder of Tina Cribbs and sentenced to death. Rogers was then extradited to California and tried for the murder of Sandra Gallagher, which his defense was there was another killer. The defense flopped, and in 1999, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death again. And then he was returned to Florida to carry out his original conviction. With Rogers' apprehension, over 200 police departments throughout the U.S. started looking at cases that were similar in MO to those of Rogers had committed. Rogers' MO was to smooth talk a vulnerable woman with low self-esteem at a bar, ask for a ride, stab or strangle her, slit her throat, leave her in the bathtub, and rob her of any valuables, including a car. He would evade authorities by switching license plates. Oh, and remember that scene in Home Alone when the two burglars leave the faucet on at each of their crime scenes, and when apprehended, that's when the police knew which crimes they had committed? Yeah, get this. Rogers was so white trash proud that one aspect of his MO was to leave shit in the toilet at his crime scenes. Apparently, this was a middle finger to sanitation that he had since childhood. What an infantile, arrogant, pathetic, narcissistic Neanderthal. I think that's an insult to Neanderthals. Anyway, with 2 death sentences in 2 different states, police investigating other crimes with Rogers as a possible or probable predator felt that it was not worth the grief of the families or the financial expense to further bring Rogers to trial. So the number 70 plus victims is unlikely since he was such a sloppy killer, but perhaps he did kill more than his official known number of victims. By 2010, and having made a profit and having his ego stroked by female fans buying locks of his hair and autograph index cards, Rogers began to feel a bit neglected and forgotten. Rogers was so desperate for attention, to stay relevant, or to stave off the death sentence, that he started to claim some of the killings attributed to the Green River Killer in Seattle during the 1980s, which I did a video on, so you'll have to check that out. He also claimed that it was he that killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman while he was in California in 1994. Rogers claimed that O.J. asked him to steal back a pair of $20,000 diamond earrings that he had given to Nicole. He said that O.J. told him where a spare key to the condo was and that if killing her was necessary, that was not a problem. Rogers claimed that after he was done with the attack on Nicole, O.J. came to verify she was dead. There were so many potholes in his story, they became craters made by asteroids of illogic. His story was ridiculous, lacked evidence, and even the crime itself was completely not his MO. If he had keys to the condo, why attack outside? Why would O.J. okay a non-intruder attack? That would lead investigators to conclude the perp knew the victim. And he murdered her without getting the one thing he was there to get? And why the fuck would O.J. hire someone so he could be alibied somewhere else and then go to the crime scene? Not to mention, Rogers' other victims, he fled the state immediately, but he didn't leave California immediately until after he killed Sandra Gallagher over a year and a half later in 1995. When Rogers sent a criminal profiler paintings he had done, he claimed they held clues that proved the crimes that he had committed. He also said that he had given his mother a gold and diamond angel pin that he had taken off of Nicole at the time of her murder. He instructed his mother to wear it during his trial for the murder of Tina Cripps. But none of the information Rogers gave was not something that wasn't already known to the public. Even at Nicole's memorial service a year after her death, news reports told of her fondness for angels and the jewelry those attending wore in her memory. Apparently, OJ's defense team knew about this claim during his civil trial, but it was so implausible that they didn't even mention the possibility as a defense. Even OJ himself dismissed the claim in an interview. SMH, that is so cold. The families of Brown and Goldman and the authorities that worked the case believe that OJ was the person who committed the murders. End of story. Florida Governor DeSantis signed Rogers' death warrant on April 15, 2025, after several unsuccessful appeals. In the last-ditch effort, appeals were made to the state and federal Supreme Courts on the basis of new evidence that Rogers was a victim of sex trafficking, head trauma, and abuse as a child, all of which failed to stay his execution. As he was to be executed on May 15, 2025, at the Florida State Prison, Rogers' last statement addressed the families of his victims and President Trump. He said, quote, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future that questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure. President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." End quote. His defiance and derangement until the very end, with a sprinkling of diluted MAGA propaganda. I think we can all agree he could recognize someone with low self-esteem, giving him the ability to like DT easily. There was no remorse or culpability according to the family members of his victims that were there to witness the execution for their loved one's killer. He was still alluding to some other reason still out there to be revealed. Most thought his death was too easy and peaceful for the horrendous nature of his crimes. But there was some closure. As for today's Roman wisdom highlights, number 1, predators come in all shapes and sizes and varying degrees of predatory behavior. They can be charming or give you the creeps. Be cautious. If someone wants to be in your presence, make them earn your trust. Make them earn the privilege it is to be near you. You are the holder of your power. Leave no doubt in your mind their worthiness to be with you. Number 2, honey, you are not his caretaker. Period. You do not have the time or energy to work on your own generational trauma and also be working on rescuing him from himself so that one day he can reach the potential you see in him. The responsibility to be a grown man needs to go back to where it belongs, with him. If he can't be trusted to regulate his emotions or actions in a healthy way, move the fuck on. You don't got time for that. He's not for you. He's not for anyone. Let him learn on his own that he needs to grow up and make himself a better human being to deserve someone like you. Number 3, if you don't know who the Hamburglar is, or what an area phone book or a pager is, your life is not as adventurous as you think. When you can say that you lived through cheesy fast food marketing that was morally questionable, and tech so slow that you actually aged significantly just trying to make a phone call, that shit means that you have the patience and fortitude to endure extreme torture. So that's it for today, my lovelies. Thank you for listening to the end. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out my other videos about fucktards Dennis Nilsen, the Grandeur Killer, Gary Ridgway, or the Times Square Ripper, Richard Cottingham. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions down below. I'm always interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you for watching. Be safe. Sending you silver streaks of wisdom.